We are going to spend the next several sessions looking back at the past and thinking about what it means for the present. And I have to begin this by noting a interesting historic irony. We are meeting today here in Pulitzer Hall, the name of this building, named for Joseph Pulitzer. And in fact, this is the Pulitzer World Room, honoring the newspaper that did so much to encourage the Spanish-American War and to lay down some of the myth, some of the language, some of the polarization that still filters into American policy today. And indeed, this handsome stained glass window behind me once graced the newsroom of the New York World. Now, one way to think of this is that Joseph Pulitzer's shadow is still hanging over all of us in journalism as we think about Cuba. But interestingly, this room, the World Room, until pretty recently was a kind of dark, grim, old university kind of space full of dark wood and heavy drapes. And it's recently been renovated into this wide open, airy space, and light filtering through these big windows, light coming in through the stained glass window. So I prefer to think of light and air coming into our thinking about Cuba through our examination of the past and the present. No more important or authoritative guide to thinking about the history of Cuba and how it plays out today than Lou Pérez of University of North Carolina. Again, the long biographies are in your packet. I'm not going to take up time. I will just say that we're honored to have someone who's devoted his lifetime to the most authoritative scholarship on this in conversation with us today. He'll talk for half hour, 40 minutes, and then we'll have questions and see where it goes.
It's a pleasure indeed to be in the Pulitzer Room. Is there a Hearst room?
No.
No Hearst room.
Hearst did not endow this school. Mr. Pulitzer did.
I'm starting off from the premise that looking at U.S.-Cuba relations, we are really examining.
Just a little closer.
Okay. We are engaged in a phenomenon that falls fully and entirely in the realm of the irrational. I'm fond of Wayne Smith, who often says that Cuba is to the United States what the full moon is to the werewolf. And in that realm, what I want to do is to talk a little bit about how these circumstances come about. We're looking at two countries that have a mutual obsessive and repulsive attitude toward each other. Two countries that are unique in the sense that they both believe that they are possessed of some exceptional destiny. What we call in the United States exceptionalism is also called in Cuba exceptionalism. So I put this map up. Most of you, I'm sure, familiar with it. You don't have to be a master geopolitician to see how Jefferson and Adams and Monroe, and in fact, all American administrations between the beginning of the 19th century and the end of the 19th century, reaching Cleveland, McKinley, saw Cuba. With the acquisition of the Louisiana Territory in 1803, followed by the acquisition of Florida in 1821, the southern frontier of the United States expands outward. It embraces the Gulf of Mexico, and all of a sudden, Cuba matters. And I would dare say that Cuba is the single most important country for the United States all through the 19th century, because its destiny, its status, its condition persists as an unresolved circumstance. And so what Americans see when they look at this map in the 19th century is a very fragile southern frontier. What happens what happens if Cuba were to fall in the possession of an enemy country? What happens if Cuba were to pass, or Spain were to pass Cuba to another country as a result of a war lost in Europe? Adams and Jefferson had sleepless nights thinking about the prospects of Cuba falling into the hands of an adversarial power. And so Adams's nightmare, ironically, becomes Kennedy's reality. And so what we have in the 19th century is a deepening belief that the future of Cuba, the inevitable future of Cuba, is to be either annexed to the United States, preferably annexed to the United States, or in one way or another, be pulled into the American orbit. Cuba cannot be allowed to fall under the control of a third party, that is, either Spain or the United States. And so what develops in the course of the 19th century is a conviction of what is known as the no transfer proposition. The no transfer proposition is very simple, as the name suggests, that under no circumstances will the United States allow Cuba to fall or pass under the sovereignty of a third party. And again, and again, and again, the Americans make it very clear to the Spanish that they will not allow Spain, insofar as they can control it, that they will not allow Spain to transfer the sovereignty of Cuba to a third party. And in fact, every successive presidential administration from the middle of the 19th century to the end of the 19th century makes it very clear, in the words of Franklin Pierce, news of the imminent transfer of Cuba to a third party will be the signal for war. In other words, early in the 19th century, the United States makes it very clear that it will not allow Cuba to be transferred to anybody other than the United States, and it would go to war to prevent that. And so the interesting constructs come out of this phenomenon. First is destiny. Why does Cuba belong part of the Union? Because if you take a look at Cuba, you look at the island and you say, geez, God put Cuba there for a purpose. Providence has dictated the future of Cuba. How could it be so close and not be part of the United States? Or conversely, what Adams calls the law of political gravitation. And this was known as the law of political gravitation, or the ripe fruit thesis, that an apple, just as when it ripens, has no choice but to come to Earth because of the power of gravity, so too Cuba. When it ripens, it will be pulled into the orbit of the United States. It's powerful science. Or Senator Seward, Lincoln's future Secretary of State, who made a speech in the Senate arguing for the annexation of Cuba, and he says, Cuba is formed by the silt that has washed out from the Mississippi River and is in fact territory of the United States because it is of the United States, and therefore, by some geological law, it belongs to the United States. So we have science, pseudoscience in one hand. We have providence. And the one constant in this phenomenon is there is no doubt in anyone's mind that Cuba will someday be part of or under the control of the United States. That is an inevitability. That is something that is, there's no discussion about this. At the same time, starting around the middle of the 19th century, Cubans begin to mobilize for independence. And as this mobilization takes form, as it evolves from the 1850s into the 1860s, as it begins to flesh out, as it begins to develop an ideology, as it begins to develop a programmatic structure, Cubans get it into their head, somehow, that they have a right to self-determination and national sovereignty. This becomes, as much for the Cubans as the U.S. possession of Cuba, an article of faith for the Cuban mobilization of independence starting by the 1860s and filling out into a full-blown credo by the 1880s 1890s. At no point in the 19th century does the United States support the independence of Cuba. Never, ever does the United States support the independence of Cuba. On the contrary, the independence of Cuba is a nightmare because Cuba falls into the category, the great metaphor of the 19th century, Cuba is Haiti. Cuba is Haiti. This large population of people of African descent, of mulattoes, and Castilians are not much better, by the way. This mixed population, now the idea that Cuba would be under the authority of Cubans is not a plausible or tenable proposition. Latin Americans are given to revolutions, to rebellions, to mutinies, to insurrections, to plots, and the idea that 90 miles away from the United States, as Adam said, almost in view of the United States, that there would be this cauldron of political instability, social disorder, was not acceptable. So let me underscore this. At no point in the 19th century does the United States, any American political figure of any stature, advocate for the independence of Cuba. On the contrary. So we have, it's sort of like you're standing on a hillside and you're looking down and you see a collision about to happen. The Americans determined that Cuba cannot be an independent nation, and the Cubans determined to be exactly independent and self-governing and a sovereign nation. So in the Pulitzer Room, 1898 happens. And what we know as the Spanish-American War really is a Cuban war for independence. The Americans didn't start a war, they joined a war in progress. And Cubans, amazingly enough, have not received sufficient credit and adequate recognition for the role they played in launching the American empire, because it was the Cubans, the debilitating blows against Spanish rule on the island of Cuba that facilitates the victory of the United States in Cuba in the summer of 1898. So I would like to dispel the proposition that the War of 1898 that enters into popular textbooks, or enters into, and I hope not in college texts, but may still enter into high school texts, that the United States went to war for the independence of Cuba is a myth. Self-serving, self-deceiving myth. This is not to suggest that the American public and churches and clubs did not support the independence of Cuba, but as the previous panelist said, that's opinion and that doesn't really matter. So, in 1898, the question is, were the Cubans winning the War of Independence? And this is a debate that has just racked historians on both sides of the Florida Straits. We don't know. We don't know if the Cubans would have won the war for their war for independence in the summer of 1898. It's an unknowable. But we do know and do have perceptions. We have perceptions. And the perceptions are just as good as the reality because it's the perceptions upon which people make decisions. And the perception of conditions in Cuba in the spring of 1898 was the Spanish could not recover sovereignty over the island, period. By the summer of 1897, it was apparent to all observers in Spain, in Cuba, in the United States, that the days of Spanish sovereignty were numbered, and indeed the numbers were few. And many people believed one more rainy season, just one more rainy season, that would deliver the coup de grace to the Spanish colonial administration. As Maximo Gomez said when he was asked who his three best generals were, he responded, Junio, Julio, y Agosto. The time when the mosquitoes multiplied. And the unsung allies of Cuban independence, the mosquito, went across enemy lines and laid waste to the Spanish armed forces. The perception was that Spain couldn't hold on to the island of Cuba. And we carry the proposition of no transfer to its logical conclusion. If Cuba could not be transferred to the sovereignty of a third party, then neither can Cuba be transferred to the sovereignty of Cubans. Cuba is too important for the United States to allow to be passed in the control of Cubans. And the United States swoops in, takes control of the war, takes control of the peace, pushes the Cubans out, signs a peace treaty with Spain. It becomes the negotiating party. The Cubans are eclipsed, and we have what Cubans in 50 years are going to say. They have been preempted from their history. The history of another country has overtaken them. They have now been excluded. They have now been expelled from their history. They have now been transformed not as to agents, but as to observers. And from January 1st, 1899, until January 1st, 1959, in the Cuban view, there is this, what we can call this hiatus in Cuban history. What the Cubans call the pseudo-republic, the neo-colony, goes by a lot of names. The fact of the matter is that on January 1st, 1898, the whole enterprise of Cuban history comes to a halt. The Cuban independence movement had sovereignty and self-determination as its principal objectives, not as an end, but as a means. Because behind that sovereignty and self-determination was a program, a social project, a political project, social justice, racial equality. And when the U.S. intervenes in 1898, all that gets pushed aside. And so there's a rebellion against the U.S.-backed government in 1906, and there's another American intervention and another occupation. And there's a rebellion against another backed U.S. government in 1917, and the U.S. intervenes and puts that aside. And the revolution of 1933, where we get what today's standards would be a kind of New Deal-ish government, was opposed ferociously by what then was passing as a good neighbor policy. It was brought down, and the person who was maneuvered and manipulated to replace that was a young sergeant by the name of Fulgencio Batista. And from 1933, and of course until December 1958, Batista runs Cuba. Now, an anecdote. In the summer of 1898, when General Shafter began negotiations with the Spanish governor of the city of Santiago for the capitulation, for the surrender of Santiago, and the Spanish surrendered the city of Santiago, Calixto Garcia, General Calixto Garcia, who'd been leading the troops of Eastern Cuba for 30 years, was told by Shafter that he could not enter the city of Santiago, that neither he nor his officers nor his men would be allowed by the Americans to enter the city of Santiago because Shafter told Calixto Garcia that the Cubans would pillage, the Cubans would plunder, that the Cubans would create nuisances, and just they weren't welcomed. So when I talk about preemption, I'm talking both literally and figuratively. General Garcia resigned his commission, and for some days, some weeks, it was problematical if the Cubans would not go to war against the Americans. That dissipates, and Cubans carried that humiliation for the next 60 years. I mention that because on January 1st, 1959, in the very first speech that Fidel Castro gave upon learning that Batista had fled, he talks about the war, the Revolutionary War was over, the insurrection had been consummated, it was finished. And then he makes this portentous allusion. And he says, and this time, the victorious Revolutionary Army will not be kept at Santiago de Cuba. Now, if you were in the American Embassy on January 1st, 1959, and you heard Fidel Castro said that, number one, it's likely that you had no idea what he was talking about. number one. Parenthetically, I just had an exercise in my class. These are upper junior and senior level students, and I said, how many people here know about the treaty of what Guadalupe Hidalgo is? Nobody knew. Nobody knew. Asked a sixth grade Mexican what the Guadalupe Hidalgo is, and the discourse would be phenomenal. So, of course, somebody in the embassy on January 1st, 1959 would have no idea what Fidel was talking about when he says this time, okay. If by chance somebody did have knowledge of what Fidel Castro referred to, the first question should have been, why is he raising that? Why is he mentioning it? Why is that relevant? It's relevant because what happens from this point on really is all about history. This was not an insurrectionary movement. This was not a revolution against Batista. It really wasn't. That's too simple. That's too facile. This was a revolution that, starting in 1958, is already identified, not only by people inside the 26th of July movement, but supporters outside the 26th of July. This is a movement of national liberation. And I would encourage you to take a look at the newspapers of Havana, or any provincial city, between January 1st, January 10th, January 15th, especially when Fidel is arriving to Havana on January 8th, and the newspapers that greeted the arrival of his column, and Che and Camilo, as they're coming into Havana, and take a look at the advertisements. They're stunning. Esso, First National Bank, Texaco, Shell, all of them are welcoming not the victorious rebel army, but what is stunning is, welcome to our liberators. Welcome to the victorious armies of national liberation. Now, what this means is that Cuban history has now been it's been picked up where the stitch was dropped, has now been resumed. In other words, what they're saying now is, where were we in January 1st, 1899? Now we're going to continue where we think we should have been and where we would like to be now. And so it's important to understand the quintessential facet of this experience, which is a movement for national sovereignty and self-determination, again and again and again. And the discourses of the Cuban leadership after 1959 and the discourses of the Cuban leadership in the 1880s and 90s are exactly alike. No cost is too high to pay. No struggle is too long to bear. Nothing at all is too much to maintain the proposition of national sovereignty and self-determination. So in point of fact, what this discourse leads after 59, it creates a highly untenable situation for opposition, because to oppose a government that has now fulfilled the national liberation, to oppose a government that now has lifted Cuba to the rightful place where it belongs among the free, sovereign, self-determining nations of the world, is treason. It's treason. And so the space for opposition in Cuba, very early on, contract radically. And so what we have after 59, 1960, is a government and an administration and a people, not all, of course, not a people, who sustain themselves on the proposition of self-determination and national sovereignty. It is the one common denominator from the 1960s through the last decades of the 19th century. So, in terms of normalizing relations with Cuba, that's the one uncompromising element of this. And again and again and again, the speeches of the leadership, up and down the leadership, is, we will, as they said in the 19th century, we will endure hardship, We will endure warfare. We will endure starvation. We will, as Fidel Castro said in the 1980s, if necessary, go back to live in the caves where Columbus found us. But under no circumstances will we compromise on the proposition of national sovereignty and self-determination. And anyone who suggests a compromise along those lines is either banished or deemed to be a traitor. So let me leave it here and then maybe have conversations in the realms of irrationality and
Great talk. In 1989, I was covering the fall of the Berlin Wall. And everybody was interested in Latin America, was saying, okay, Cuba now. And I'm wondering, one of the arguments that you would hear is that if the Castro government, entre comillas, falls, that all the Cubans from Miami are just going to rush in and take over the island. Now, and this whole conference is about that, we're looking at a time that may or may not be a sea change. So I'm wondering, through your historical parameters, how do you interpret 1989 and how do you interpret what's going on now in terms of this issue of nationalism?
we barely know what's happened in the past. There are so many striking parallels from which I don't want to draw any morals or any conclusions, just bring them to your attention, between the last decades of the 19th century and the last decades of the 20th, and perhaps spilling into 21st. A large, proportionally probably as large a population of Cubans living in the United States. Key West, Tampa, New York, Philadelphia, New Orleans, many of whom were educated, many of whom were born here, many of whom who took out naturalized citizenship, and many of whom after 1902, or maybe even as early as 1899 with the American occupation, go back to Cuba. Very few go back with capital. They were not capitalists. They were not business people. But they go back with a kind of with an ethos, with a psychology, with a manner, a modo de ser, blending what we can call bicultural worlds. They take back Protestant churches. They take baseball back. And they have a major role, a major part in what Cuba looks like from the 1910s to 1950s. It's hard to imagine that Cubans who are living in the United States, be it Florida or New Jersey, some sector of that population, and I don't know if it would be a generational sector, if it would be a class sector, has to go back and has to play a role in what happens in Cuba if the circumstances allow. And I say that's the big if. Otherwise, it's perfectly clear, to me, it's possible that U.S.-Cuban relations could exist the way they are indefinitely. Because what the Americans want is the one thing Americans want is the one thing that Cubans don't give them, and that is an apology. That is to say, okay, we will yield on national sovereignty and self-determination. In other words, the one condition that the Americans impose on Cuba right now under the present leadership is the one condition the Cubans will not give. Yeah.
This was fascinating. You talk about all these parallels between the late 19th century and the revolution, or this connection, this continuing, the pause in history. Can you talk a little bit, though, about what a layman would say is a major difference, which is that in 1898 there's no Marxism, there's no socialism. How does that become, in some ways, the way in which that national liberation movement history is manifested?
But there is socialism in the 19th century, and there is Marxism in the 19th century. And much of the Cuban program, the Cuban social project for independence, as it was forged by Martí, for example, by people living in this country who witnessed the great strikes and the capital labor strikes of the 1890s, who lived through the lynchings, who looked at the suffrage movement, just a constant. In other words, Cubans were present at a very critical set of decades in this country. And a lot of that was assimilated and inscribed into the larger project of the Cuban nation. If you take a look at the people who signed the founding document of the PRC, the Cuban Revolutionary Party, Martí's Revolutionary Party, there are a couple of names that jump out at you, okay? One is Carlos Baliño. Okay, Carlos Baliño is a cigar worker in Key West, and he's a signatory of the founding of the party. You flash forward 2 decades, and Baliño is the signatory and founder of the Cuban Communist Party. Okay, Diego Vicente Tejeda, a socialist, a signer of the party. So these elements are all part. I mean, it's a kind of weird metaphysics, okay, that gets shoehorned into this project, and there are strands and elements that just kind of float. But what they do is they leave a legacy, okay, and history becomes a politics in Cuba from 1902 until January 1st, 1959. Everybody who runs for political office, who wants to establish his or her credentials of being a Cuban, talks about to finish the project of José Martí. That's again and again and again and again. That is a recurring motif. I mean, the way history insinuated itself into Cuban politics, just because of this critical crossroads of 1898, is phenomenal. It's phenomenal. And so the element of Marxism, anarchism, all that stuff it's floating around in this cosmology of Cuban in the 19th century.
Thank you very much for this recopilation of mythology of the Cuban Revolution and the so-called sovereignty. And I wanted if you can comment some points going to, with the nationalistic speech that allowed all kind of impunity to keep that so-called sovereignty that in many cases in history, sovereignty is the basis for destruction of society or fascism. And what will be your comment in legal terms about the Cuban first socialist constitution of 1976, approved by 98% of my people, where in the text, in the constitutional text, it was consecrated that the Cuban Republic depended on Soviet Union and the presence in the internationalism, that's the ingerence, the intervention of foreign countries, but in this case, socialist. So how a republic that was narrated as neo-colonial or dependent suddenly is consecrated in our constitutional text, what the Platt Amendment never did, because
it wasn't the Constitution.
No, it was an amendment to the Constitution.
But it was an organic part of the Constitution.
Okay.
It was an appendix, but it was part of the Constitution.
But it was possible to be removed by constitutional means, as it happens in 1934. But anyway, I'm not talking about the amendment, okay, but the real Constitution as a reaction for being more sovereign, but in a way delivering our sovereignty to another country, to the point that in 1992, the Republic had to change his constitution because the Soviet Union has ceased to exist. And Cuba should have ceased to exist also by constitution in 1992, but we changed the constitution and then again in 2002. So some reflection about this sovereignty.
It is changed. History overtook that constitution. And as a result, the Cuban Constitution was modified to reflect the new geopolitical reality of the world. But the issue of sovereignty, as it fixes itself in the Cuban sensibility is all about the United States. It's not about the Soviet Union. It's not about, forming this kind of junior partnership or finding patronage from the Soviets. What drives Cuban history is not Cuba's not Poland, and in a sense that there's no need for the Cubans to have to defend national sovereignty vis-a-vis from the Soviets, because the conventional wisdom is anytime the Cubans want to get rid of the Soviets, they can. Soviets got rid of them first because the Soviets ceased to exist. But in the Cuban problematic, it's the United States and not the Soviet Union. And what you say is correct. And then it was modified because of the changing world condition.
I wonder why the Cuban people doesn't migrate to the Russian republics, but to the country of conflict. Is a paradox.
That's a complicated question that we could probably spend more time talking about. Yes.
Hi. I've spoken to a handful of people over the years who, while Fidel Castro was still president, they met with these people from Tampa. Each group went separately. They didn't really know each other, and they all came back with the same opinion that Fidel Castro was more open to change than we gave him credit for, but he felt backed into a corner by many of his speeches early on in his presidency for the things that he would do and would not allow. And then they said when he leaves power, whoever comes next might implement some of those changes. I'm curious as a historian, and then of course Raul comes along and he's starting to change things. As a historian who's probably knows many of his speeches and words more, do you think there's any validity? And these are their opinion. I'm wondering if you think there's any validity to those opinions.
Fidel Castro was a brilliant historian. Fidel Castro, from 1959 through the early 60s, is a historian. Raul, not so much. The 26th of July speech that Raul gave 2013, was it last year, in Guantanamo. If you ever get a chance to look at the video, not the transcript, but the video of the speech, it's painfully embarrassing. Painfully embarrassing. Because what is happening, and I'm glad you asked this question, what is happening is that the use of history has kind of crossed a threshold in which we can now look at this as the abuse of history. History is now a trope. And Raul, 2 years ago, his speech went back to the same thing again and again and again, and people have heard the story so many times, again and again and again, that its effect, its resonance has now begun to wear off. And so the great danger among colleagues of mine in Cuba, historians, is the degree to which the history of Cuba, this nationalistic history, has now become so misused, so abused, that the young people are now turning away from it as propaganda. And that creates very, very serious issues for the development of a kind of historical consciousness among young people in Cuba. Whether Fidel Castro would turn his back on history, Fidel Castro was eminently pragmatic. And I don't think what he said in 1975 would have much to do with what he would do in 2005.
I have a question. Thank you, Professor. And I want to continue the discussion where Orlando left it. And I wonder if your answer, like the gravitation of Cuba towards the Soviet Union and currently towards Venezuela, wasn't really a concern for the Cuban government. And the concern still is the U.S. Isn't that a sign that at some point this national sovereignty debate is also construction to gain legitimacy in the country, within the country?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I think
that there's something constructed.
No, I mean, I think one of the principal rationale of the Cuban government today, independently of the embargo, the principal rationale is national sovereignty and self-determination. Okay, that's the umbrella that everything is folded under, including the embargo. The embargo is a subset of that. But the umbrella that contributes powerfully to the sustenance of the politics and policies of the present government and the government before it is national sovereignty and self-determination, for which there can be no compromise. Okay? End of story. End of story.
Which is interesting because now I'm hearing like very contradictory messages of people advocating for changing policies, saying that the Cuban government is not legitimizing itself anymore based on nationalism or anti-imperialism, but you're saying the opposite.
I would argue that that continues to be probably one of the most important elements of the logic of the Cuban government.
Picking up on that idea of self-determination, I was wondering if you could track historically Cuba's relationship or sort of official relationship to the Cubans who have left, who came to the United States and then went back. I mean, one of the more significant changes, it seems to me, in Cuba recently is the way that the Cuban government talks about Cubans who leave or Cubans who have gone. And so, but I'm wondering what the historical context for that is. I mean, were they welcomed when they came back in 1902, or were they seen with skepticism? How has that changed over time?
Again, a very long process, but at the risk of oversimplifying, the Cubans who lived in the United States, let's say anywhere from the 1880s through the beginning of the American occupation in 1899, had a tremendous advantage in getting a head start in political office, public administration, elected office. Because number one, Americans could deal with them. Number two, they were mostly white. Number three, they spoke English. Number four, they knew about the weird American psyche. And they could very easily make their services available and kind of bridge this bicultural world. And, you know, the first president of Cuba, Estrada Palma, is an American citizen, a Quaker. And that kind of gives it to you in a nutshell. So these Cubans who go back have a tremendous advantages in a regime, in a system in which American hegemony is the overriding social reality. You know, Menocal was an administrator. Before he became president of Cuba, he was an administrator to American Sugar Corporation. I mean, these people come out of American corporate structures, and they enter American corporate structures because they are bilingual, they're bicultural. There's a wonderful phrase in Carlos Loreda's book, Generales y Doctores, where the phrase is, knowing English is a guarantee of never being without a job. Right? And in the Republic, that was absolutely true. Schools that were teaching English were a growth industry. So these people who are going back in the early 20th century have tremendous advantage. And it's not difficult to imagine, if we just close our eyes and imagine, that a similar phenomenon would not happen in the not too distant future. That the reality is that Cuba and the United States have to make peace with each other. Sometime, the geography is just too strong. You cannot, at some point, under some circumstance, under some set of conditions, these two countries are going to begin talking to each other, and maybe not next year, maybe not 10 years from now, maybe 50 years from now, something's going to happen where there's going to be an American embassy in Havana and a Cuban embassy in Washington, and flights are going to be inundating the island with American tourists. That's an absolute certainty at some point. When that moment arrives, whatever generation of Cubans happen to be living in the United States who are bilingual, bicultural, binational, go back and they're in the catbird seat.
If you maintain the idea of self-determination, the people who are doing the self-determining are those bicultural. Do they see that as self-determination, or do they see that as?
I mean, that you hear in private conversation in Cuba, only in private conversation in Cuba, okay? And the phrase would be dignity, okay? Because that's what national sovereignty and self-determination really kind of folds into. At what price? And so there is kind of rumblings every now and then. You talk to in private conversation, you know, how much suffering is this worth? And this whole phenomenon of cuentapropismo you will hear people in Cuba say privately, all this struggle, all this sacrifice, all this anguish for cuentapropismo. Right? And that's sobering. And what keeps this contained, what keeps this, in place, national sovereignty and self-determination. We in Cuba say what happens in Cuba. End the story.
Professor, in Cuba history, the principal issue was self-determination, national liberation. These ideas live in the Fidel Castro minds and millions of Cubans. Che Guevara, with his international ideas, take a position in this debate?
Not that I know of. Che Guevara did not know Cuban history. And if you read his guerrilla warfare book, okay, that he kind of offers a model based on the Cuban experience, his ignorance of Cuban history as the conditions that give rise to the model, the profundity of the ignorance is chilling.
Folks, we'll do maybe 2 more questions.
Oh, sorry.
I want to go back to Orlando's question and just probe a little bit more on that one. Because I think what we're hearing is you saying policy and sort of belief and faith and what drove things in Cuba was this idea of national sovereignty. But it feels like when a country is willing to submit to a constitutional relationship with another country, as in the case of the Soviet Union that Orlando brought up. And I remember a few years back, Felipe Pérez Roque brought up the possibility, just as a kind of a balloon, of annexing to Venezuela. I mean, these things seem extreme and frankly kind of crazy. And when you look at a lot of Cuban history, it feels like, actual sovereignty maybe happened in the early 60s for like one brief moment, and then in the 90s for, early 90s for, again, one brief moment. But it feels like national sovereignty is less of a policy and less a matter of a driving force than a mantra or an aspirational affirmation. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, so let me back up, because it's important to understand that what you're describing as this, strange, linkage, a strange connection of the Constitution of 1776 with the Soviet Union. The 1901 Constitution that was framed under American occupation incorporates the Platt Amendment. And the Platt Amendment is the Platt Amendment. No, but don't exhale that way. Let me finish. No, but you're ready to say something here. Let me finish. And it incorporated the Platt Amendment that was a total compromise of Cuban sovereignty and indeed extracted territory for Cuba as a condition for its independence. So we know that Cuba received its independence in 1902, independence without sovereignty, self-government without self-determination. And the 1976 Constitution, certainly, it links Cuba to the Soviet Union. But in 1976, coming after the failure of the 10 million ton crop, Cuba was a disaster area. So what is pragmatically Cuba's choice in 1976, the way pragmatically was the Constituent Assembly's choice in 1901 when they were told, you include this in your amendment or there's no end to the occupation. So what do?
I find it fascinating that you link those two things, because to me the Platt Amendment seems very much imposed, and the situation in 1976 seems, let's say, a little more internal. And certainly when Pérez Roque's comment about annexing Cuba to Venezuela came about, I mean, Venezuela didn't have a gun to his head. So again, I'm just wondering, how much of this is, a lot of smoke and mirrors.
Well, as I said,
and how honest it really is. I mean, I don't know that you can answer my question, but I'm throwing it out there because it doesn't feel, I know that that we Cubans have this bravado, this tremendous, swagger about sovereignty and nationalism, but in practice, it feels to me that we have a history of incredible dependence, and that in part it's a complex about that history that brings out that bravado and that swagger about sovereignty. I think our whole spiel on sovereignty is bullshit.
Okay. I would agree with everything you said except for the last couple of words. Let me reiterate. The issue of Cuban national sovereignty and self-determination is a very specific issue that bears directly and exclusively on the United States. That's where it resides. It doesn't have anything to do with Honduras. It doesn't have anything to do with Venezuela. It has nothing to do with England. It has to do with this, as I preface my comments, with this mutual weird relationship between both countries, where the Americans are determined to possess Cuba, and the Cubans are determined not to be possessed by the Americans. And that is the engine. Now, you say it's bullshit? Maybe, but it works. It's bullshit that works. They're still in power. They're still there. You want proof? There's your proof. Where are the Sandinistas? Gone, compromised. Soviet Union, gone, compromised. And so you have Cuba, like the Energizer rabbit, still going because they say no, no. And they justify that and are able to maintain an internal consensus, draconian as it may be, on the basis of national sovereignty, self-determination.
Of an idea.
Well, whatever. But in other words, as in this country, you don't play around with national security. Okay, you don't play with national security. And the Cubans are obsessed with national security, and not without some justification. Yes.
Oh, yeah. In my office, I have a shelf of books on Cuban history, and your books take up a whole line. So I wanted to just recognize the contribution you have made and continue to make to the study of Cuban history. And I wanted to pick up on the very last thing that you said in your remarks before the question and answer, which was something to the effect that given the establishment of these principles of self-determination and sovereignty, anyone who seemed like they were questioning that or could be made to look like they were questioning that, the space for them was very small after the triumph of the revolution. And so my question has to do with what impact or effect modifying, changing the U.S. approach toward Cuba that is perceived as threatening those things could have on the space for dissidents, democracy, free expression, freedom of the press within Cuba. Does the United States policy potentially have a way to affect that, given that it's used as kind of, we're being attacked, so shut up and stay in line?
I don't think there could be a more radical policy change that won't happen. And if you're really, really cynical, and you want to say, okay, let's bring down this system. The easiest way is for the White House to say tomorrow, look, we want normal relations. We're ending the embargo. We want to have normal, full relations. We're going to get rid of Helms-Burton. We no longer want to overthrow you. We want to be friends. Let's trade. Okay. I think that would deliver such a crisis in Cuba. Maybe not immediately, but in the short run, it would deliver and produce a crisis in Cuba. You want space? You want space in there for dissent? Okay, then remove the pretext or the reality, however you want to look at it, of a nation under siege. And then you get space. And then it becomes, indeed, Cubans who will exercise self-determination and national sovereignty.
It's a short comment and a question. When Carlos Laje made what was a mistake when they inaugurated the petroleum plant, and he stood up and talked about Hugo Chavez being president of both Cuba and Venezuela, that drew such a negative reaction across the country. People, ordinary, of every stripe, were outraged, and he was quickly slapped down for it. So in that moment, it was just not the United States. People reacted against the question of Chavez. But the question has to do really with the last article published and signed by Fidel Castro on the New York Times editorial, in which he quotes extensively from the Times and then has 2 paragraphs at the end, which, talking to people, and I interpret it as saying, they're not doing this for us. It's the same old thing. They have this. The U.S. still has the same goals. The New York Times is laying out the same goals. They still want to get rid of us, and they've coded it in this nice language. I wondered how you read the end of that editorial, that article by him.
I confess I didn't read it. I'm sorry. But I mean, at that point, let me add that something not dissimilar happened in the summer of 1998, at a time when the Cubans were very beholden to Spain. The irony of the special period in 1998 is in 1898 the Americans presumed to go to Cuba to rescue the island from Spain, and in 1998 it's the Spaniards who are going there presumably to rescue Cuba from the United States. But there was a moment when Eusebio Leal gets on a helicopter with the Spanish ambassador, and they fly over the entrance to the harbor of Santiago, where the Spanish Navy was pulverized. And Eusebio Leal, in what was clearly an official act, with the Spanish ambassador, threw flowers in memory of the dead Spanish Marines and sailors. And boy, talk about indignation, talk about anger, talk about public acrimony. That moment, again, was another one of these where Spain was seeming to kind of reassert its authority. That was one of those kind of epiphany moments.
The only other time I've seen a reaction like that in Cuba is when they showed Ileana and Lincoln draping an American flag around Elian Gonzalez, and it was, the whole country was up in arms.
1 or 2 more. Great.
Hi. It's really fascinating, I have to tell you. And I was just commenting to him that you sound like the Al Pacino of the Cuban. You have this very authoritative.
Can you put that in writing for me?
Yes, compelling way to speak about these issues that really brings them to life. So I just wanted to say that, and something else. So we've talked a lot about the history, but what has intrigued me is something that you said about the inevitability of these relations eventually resuming, and that Cubans from the United States or who have grown up here or had some sort of link here will go back and they will be in the driver's seat. And this really intrigued me. Does that mean, in your sense, in your view, that these are the same people divided by politics and that they will somehow reunite, and that the last 50 years of history will disappear and we'll go back to a situation where we were before, where the Cubans from the United States or the Cubans from Miami, the big nightmare, I have to say, of many of the Cubans that I know in Cuba, comes to pass? I mean, this seems to me like a very strange prediction to make. So I was wondering if you'd elaborate. Thank you.
Thank you for giving me a chance to clarify. I think Cubans living abroad, whether it's Spain, whether it's the United States, are going to go back, and they're going to go back with capital and technical know-how and experience. I fear that rejoining of the two halves of people of the nation may be a very difficult process. I think it will be because you're going to have, what you will have is a kind of an administrative, bureaucratic, political structure on one hand, and capital, internal and capital coming in from abroad, and how that gets negotiated is, I think, anybody's guess. But it is, to me, inconceivable that Cubans who are already being welcomed back now, as we speak, would not, under different circumstances, when there's normal, perfectly normal relations, would not go back and play a major role somehow in the development, the economic development, and indeed the social development, perhaps the political development of the island. It's inconceivable that some fragment of 1 million Cubans abroad will not go back, especially in the last 10, 15 years, who have not left for political reasons.
One last question. Yeah?
Hi, Lou. Nice to see you. Have to come all the way to New York. My question is, we've been looking at this kind of in a tunnel between the United States and Cuba, or from Cuba to the United States. And in terms of what kind of change is possible, what kind of change is predictable or not. What role do you see the rest of Latin America and the changing fabric, the changing landscape in Latin America playing in this U.S.-Cuba peace, if any?
I don't know. I really couldn't even begin to, maybe after we had a couple of beers and we were, just sort of speaking freely, we would ramble, but anything that would be, would be intellectually useful, I can't think of right now.
Okay. Thank you.
I just give you a very brief sense of where you are and what that very strange and illuminated stained glass panel represents. So this building was endowed, and the school was created by Joseph Pulitzer, who at the end of his very successful life as a press baron presided over a newspaper called the New York World, which was in its day, at the turn of the century, a great innovator, the first newspaper to invent the color Sunday comic and various other innovations. And his life is worth mentioning very briefly. He came to the United States as a mercenary to fight in the Civil War on the side of the North, because when the draft was instituted during the Civil War, it was permissible to purchase a substitute if you were drafted, and wealthy families in the Hudson Valley would occasionally place ads in impoverished European countries seeking substitutes. And in Hungary, where Joseph Pulitzer was growing up as one of, I think, like 9 or 10 brothers, 8 of whom had perished of illness, he saw this ad and he came to the United States as a German speaker and a horseman, and he entered into a cavalry unit in New York that was all German speaking, and he spent the entire war riding up and down the Shenandoah Valley, apparently never fired a shot, was never shot at, was discharged in 1864 as an American resident, didn't speak a word of English. So he went to St. Louis, where there was a German community. He started a newspaper there. He entered into politics. He became an investigative reporter. He joined the Democratic Party, which was then the kind of minority party after the war, and he carried out investigative reporting about his opponents in local elections. One of them objected to his story one morning, came over to the newsroom, and Pulitzer pulled out a pistol and shot him. So before we romanticize the founding story, he didn't kill him. He did wound him. He was later indicted and occasionally dragged back to St. Louis to face charges. But he came to New York and he created this great fortune. But I was thinking about this because as I was listening to some of the references to Cuban history, reading his biography, toward the end of his life he became blind, and he was in a great deal of pain, and he was very sensitive to noise. He had a mansion on the east side, but he found the noise of the city just intolerable. So he purchased what was then one of the world's largest yachts, and he sailed to Cuba. And he would essentially have his staff maintain the boat, and he would go down in the cabin and pull the curtains and bob in the water off the coast of Cuba just to try to find peace. And then he would do business by telegraph and radio with his newsroom. Anyway, that was at the heart of his newsroom, which was a skyscraper over near what is now the entrance to the Brooklyn Bridge. They tore the building down when they built an on-ramp, unfortunately. But some of the relics are here, and his grandson just made this room possible to enjoy again. So I just thought I'd mention that little bit of history, and also just say that I'm really glad you're here. The work that this conference represents is really at the heart of our priorities at the school. We feel very clearly that journalism is now a global profession. Our student body reflects that. About a third of our students come from outside the United States, and we're working very hard to make sure that the speakers and the ideas and the curricula and the examples that we teach in the classroom reflect the fact that virtually all of our students, whether American or non-American, are going to go into newsrooms that have global audiences and are thinking about how to build multinational newsrooms. Last night we had the Cabot Prizes here. Some of you may have joined us for that, and so we're very glad that you're here, and thankful to Bruce and the Dart Center for organizing this, and to Atlantic and to Ford for supporting it. So my main goal is to introduce my boss, which is always a pleasure. John Coatsworth is the provost of Columbia and a professor of international and public affairs and of history. He's, as you know, one of the country's leading scholars on Latin American economic and international history, and he has been so for the last 15 or 20 years. He came here to lead SIPA, the School of International and Public Affairs, a few years ago from Harvard, where he was the founding director of the David Rockefeller Center for Latin American Studies, and I know many of you have encountered him in these roles, so I won't read the rest of his resume, but I just would say that from the perspective of people like myself, he's also a great provost. He's really, it's a tough job at a university of this scale, as I'm sure he could tell you, to thread diverse graduate schools together and to support diverse deans with lots of different agendas, but he does a really fabulous, very even and fair and supportive job of it, and I've really enjoyed working with him. So with that, I just welcome John to the microphone. Please welcome John Coatsworth.
Thank you, Steve. It's great to be here and to see so many old friends. I want to say thanks to Steve for making this possible and for inviting me here to speak to you. To Bruce Shapiro for putting this amazing event together, and to all of you who've come. This is probably the biggest collection of Cuban experts, especially in the journalist community, that is assembled ever. And it's a testimony to Bruce's organizing skills. I should also mention Meg Crahan, who's sitting over here, who is the director of the Columbia University Cuba program. It's a modest program that exchanges faculty and students. Mostly we invite Cuban social scientists, economists especially, to Columbia to spend a period of a semester or so interacting with our economists and engaging in research projects. So each semester we have one or two, and it's mainly Meg's work that makes that possible. We've also been able to send a number of Columbia faculty to Cuba to make presentations and to learn from their colleagues. I first went to Cuba in, well, actually before any of you were born. I went to Cuba in 1963. My college roommate, as I recall, was a subscriber to one of these radical newspapers that circulated at the time, and he saw an ad in the classified section that said, if you want to go to Cuba this summer, call this telephone number. It turned out to be a number at a rather dark apartment on Manhattan's Lower East Side. So we traveled from Wesleyan University down there to be interviewed. It was an appropriately conspiratorial setting. We passed the interview, and we went to Cuba and spent 2 months there in the summer of 1963. Actually, it was supposed to be only 1 month, but the Cubans had arranged for us to go there, but they hadn't quite managed to put together how they were going to get 59 American students back to the U.S. in the midst of a travel ban. Actually, they had very good relations with Franco-Spain, so they bumped 59 Cubans from an Iberia DC-3 that was crossing to Madrid from Havana, a rather bumpy ride, as I recall, and put us on, finally, when they got so tired of us they couldn't keep us around any longer. We arrived in Madrid on our way back to New York to be greeted by several hundred Cuban exile families who were expecting their relatives on the plane. And we were not comforted by the fact that the Guardia Civil protected us with great efficiency. Our trip was denounced by President Kennedy at a press conference. We made the front pages of the New York Times. We were the first group to break the travel ban, or at least to challenge it. Kennedy divided the group into the few communists who were leading it and the dupes that followed, and I was one of the dupes. On the way to Cuba, I met another member of this student group, and I'm happy to say that 3 months ago we celebrated our 50th wedding anniversary. So from my point of view, it was a terrific opportunity. I'm not sure quite any longer how it ended in marriage, but I do know that on our first acquaintance, my wife-to-be thought that I looked much too gringo not to be suspicious. And after our first cup of coffee, ran back to the hotel we were staying and said to her roommate, Wendy, I think I've just had coffee with the Fink. So convinced that I was an FBI informant, or even worse, she made great efforts to avoid me for the next few weeks. And the dynamic that I created as I chased after her just simply ended in marriage a year later. And I've been back to Cuba a number of times since then, now that I've got my passport back, which was confiscated when we arrived back in the States for a while. And so I've been an observer, although not, as do Pérez and so many of you, a researcher and a scholar of Cuba. I think Cuba and the United States are both at a sort of crossroads, an interesting crossroads. Cuba, as you know, is in a transition, and an extraordinarily difficult transition to manage, and one whose outcome is not entirely clear even to those who are its authors and leaders. And the United States is in a transition, we hear, because of the many productive conversations that seem to be taking place at a lower level between representatives of our two governments on issues that range from disaster preparedness to what to do about oil spills and immigration. And there are now again rumors that there will be some dramatic gesture in the direction of restoring official diplomatic relations, or perhaps ending a portion of or all of the embargo sometime after the coming elections. I think the probability for a Cuban success in managing its transition is a bit greater than the probability of a change at that level in U.S.-Cuban relations, but you are people that know much more about that than I would. Bruce asked me to say a word or two about what I think might be missing from press accounts in Cuba. And I don't, actually the fact is I don't think very much is missing. But if there is one thing that's missing, it's a reflection of my sense of, from visits to the island, of the kinds of people that are trying to manage this really complex transition. It's not a transition that in a Caribbean island located 90 miles from a superpower one should ever want to undertake willingly. A transition from an old-style Soviet planned economy to something that looks more like the Chinese model, right? Economic liberalization without a political transition, or at least without an immediate political transition. If you have 1.5 billion people, an impregnable People's Liberation Army, if you're not insecure, and you have very little outside influence to affect a majority of your population, a transition of the kind that the Chinese made, or even the Vietnamese, on the basis of the national unity that we helped to create in the 1960s and 70s. That transition strikes me as something that's manageable despite all of its bumps, but I'm not sure that Cuba can be successful in the transition that's now undertaking under the circumstances that it faces as a Caribbean island so close to the United States and so economically dependent upon the United States and the outside world for its economic success should it ever reach there. What I do know is that Cuba has faced a series of daunting challenges in the past, and the regime has survived. And it survived in miraculous fashion. I'm not sure what would happen to most governments in the world with a 40% decline in GDP, which the Cubans faced at the time of the collapse of the Soviet Union. But the fact that so little happened in the island in the decades after that is really quite a remarkable development. So what I think journalists may miss, or at least the stories may miss, is the kind of people who are leading Cuba and what their relationship is with the underlying population. Perhaps I'm not reading the right things, but the people that I know who are in the regime, economists, diplomats, and the like, are people that I have found to be, given their occupations, as honest as any here, as devoted to their country, people who share the values that we hold dear. They balance them a bit differently, but they are people who I would be glad to work with on any project. If there has been a success in Cuba over the years, it has been a success in convincing large numbers of very good people to work for the regime to make it better. And I think that's not something that comes through all the time. That is, we're not dealing with the other. We're dealing with ourselves, with people like us making judgments that are a bit different than we have the luxury of making, but judgments that come from the same value system and the same set of preoccupations about the world and their country. What Cuba has on offer, I think, is not really as encouraging as we would all hope for it. In the Cuban view, they are being offered by the United States something like political democracy, if you imagine it, they can't be, elections in small countries can't be bought. Something like economic growth, if your view of a successful future is a return to the days when Cuba was the place where Americans went to do things they couldn't do legally in the US, or even on an optimistic scale, something like another Caribbean island with a lot of hotels. And not much sovereignty, not much what makes Cuba, Cuba. So that's what my friends say in Cuba. They're facing a future that the US is offering them, which is not the one they would choose. But what Cubans are being offered by their own regime is not much more encouraging either. Certainly it's a sovereign island. They simply don't take orders from Washington, and when Washington irritates them, they can respond in ways that have past proved to be quite irritating to us. So Cubans are offered sovereignty, sometimes identified with the social welfare system that was created after the revolution and that has produced a country with the social statistics of a developed nation, an infant mortality rate lower than the United States, life expectancy higher than most of the rest of Latin America. So they're offered sovereignty and what is identified now really as Cuban socialism. But they're not offered anything like economic growth yet, and their prospects for that are diminishing. I think the estimate is that in the current year, capital formation in Cuba will be about 5.4% of GDP, down from 7 or 8. The average for Latin America is probably in the 20s. They're not going to grow at that rate. So they're maybe offered economic growth, but certainly not in the immediate future. And they're certainly not being offered anything like a competitive political system that could be put up for sale anytime soon. So my sense of the future of the island is probably a bit more pessimistic than some of you that travel there more often and are more often infected with Cubans' natural optimism. But want to say how grateful we all are to have reporters and historians like you writing from Cuba. There is much more understanding, I think, in the United States now about what the island is and what it's about than would have been the case without your contribution. So I want to say thanks for that, too, and thanks to Bruce for inviting me. Have a good conference.